And his daughter, Jennifer, was Siegfried's wife, was probably the most admirable. I mean, she welcomed and was hospitable to Hitler and so on. Yeah, but even in Wagner's operas, there's anti-Semitic. Albrecht, Beck Messer. How are you? Morning. Good. Thank you. I enjoyed doing it. George, how are you? Hello.
Hi, Ron. How are you?
More fun than with somebody.
Right. Oh, I know. Oh, good. You know, he said, let me see if I can write. So I'm glad that you're thinking about rhymes and so on.
Sure.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's for sure. Good morning.
Are you watching tennis?
As much as I can. I did see not the end last night. Did you? I did the end. Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah.
Is he something else?
He really is. But Nadal won his first major in 19.
Did he?
These guys have a protege.
He's going to be like the next Nadal.
That's for sure.
Morning.
I'm going to put these here, so these come in, you might encourage them. He said it was literal, so literal. I said it was that it was starts the resurrection or immortality. And I think they're not you know, they don't do
It looks like
Did you get a sheet?
No, I didn't.
They're at the end of that table. See them?
Okay, right, I know, that's what's okay. No. Good morning, it's so good to see you. So good to be here. They're cutting, I don't know if you're going to make announcements or there's room to do this. But Ridol's had a little bit of a snafu in communication, so
Okay.
a little delay. Maybe it's too early for that, but,
Do it.
okay.
So, but you're gonna have to kind of raise your hand because I'm gonna get myself real involved.
Well, but
Do it.
okay, next week too.
You know, I'm gonna do a Chefiano, talk about the bagels and so
There's
on.
so much going on. Yeah,
Just raise your hand so that we can be sure to do it.
okay,
Yeah.
okay.
It's so, you sent me something about
I
coffee.
did, and I didn't want to take your time right now with so much going on for your.
I didn't quite understand what you were looking for.
Well, I don't want to. I don't.
Okay.
Yeah. There's.
Let's
yes.
talk.
Let's talk. Yes.
Good.
I'm not going to take it.
Okay, thanks.
Or look for your response on the cuff.
Good, but
After-
I was a little confused by it, so.
Okay. Okay.
Good morning, everybody. Shabbat Shalom. I can't tell you how exciting this moment is for me. This is really the first time in a couple of years that we have the chance of doing a whole year together. starting now. We've been together live for many months, ending late in June, but this promises to be a regular year for us, and that's very exciting. So glad to be together to start another year of Torah study. Welcome to those who are live streaming. Several things to do this morning. I hope everybody has a packet of materials which we're going to work through this morning and possibly into the future. You know, we have a prayer, the Shehechianu, that I always liken to the old string around our fingers. Remember, we used to do that to remember something. And a Shehechianu is a reminder of our blessings. It's so easy. I know myself, I get up in the morning, I look at my calendar, what am I up to today? Do I have any time to step back and reflect on what I'm doing? Or do I just go ahead and do it as well as I can until I drop off later that night? And it's always important, I think, to take a moment to remember how fortunate we are, how blessed, how lucky to be able to have high moments by ourselves and with others, and certainly in community. So let's do the Shehechianu together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, Shehechianu v'kiyamanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. We praise you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe, who has kept us alive, sustained us, and enabled us to arrive at this precious moment. Amen. And it is a precious moment, isn't it, for us to be together and to be studying Torah together. Community in Torah, immanence and transcendence, living our lives and striving for more learning, more understanding, more compassion, search for justice, and so on. So, several preliminary things. First of all, of course, we're returning to our bagel table. I'm not sure we even have enough for today, but we have bagels every week, bagels and coffee. We are live streaming every week to those of you who are on live stream. And we have picking up of the bagels. So there are logistical matters that we attend to for Torah study. Sandy Zeev over here has the beginnings of the sign-up sheets. So let me say a couple of things about it. First of all, the bagels cost us a little more than $35 every week. The live streaming costs $15 a week, and of course pickup is we're grateful for that, but there's no cost for that. So let me say a few things about it. The sheets are coming around. If you want to sponsor one or more bagel weeks, just recognize that it's $35 and send in your checks to my assistant Cindy. Live streaming, $15 a week. And Joan Levy has again graciously agreed to coordinate the pickup so that if you volunteer to pick up the bagels at Bialy's Bagels in the Saturday morning, I can't remember what time people pick them up, 8 o'clock?
Yeah.
Something like that. Yeah. Joan will have the list and call you earlier that week just to remind you that it's the pickup week. I want to say something about live streaming. So those of you who are live streaming and intend to live stream most or all of the time, I'd like you to consider sponsoring a live stream week or two. I don't want to be too precise about this. Some of you may want to sponsor a live stream or two as well. But I would like those of you who are enjoying the live streaming in your pajamas that you help us as well. So Sandy's going to start passing the sheets around. Sign up for them as you are inclined to do. And then if we get a full list, we won't pass it around again. And if there's still several blank spaces in it, we will pass it around again in another month or two. Okay, that's the first thing. Bagels and coffee. I mean, most of you are veterans, so you know about this, but in case some of you are here for the first time, I just want to go over some of these things. So you come in the morning and you get bagels and you get coffee. If during our discussion you want a refill or another bagel, do not hesitate to get up from your seat and go get it. I'm not at all distracted or disturbed by it, and I assume that the rest of you are not as well, so that we can maintain some informality as well. And in terms of our starting and our stopping time, so we start every Shabbat morning at 9:15, and we end sometime between 10:30 and 10:45. Sometimes we go on a little bit more. I'm sure from time to time you recognize that though you want to be here, that you'll need to come late, 9:30, 9:45, 10 o'clock, and or you might need to leave early to go to a bar bat mitzvah or for another thing. And you might infer from this that you shouldn't come at all. I'd like to discourage you from that inference. It's more important to me that you're here for the time that you're here than that you're here for the entire time. So do not hesitate to come in at 9:30, 45, 10 o'clock, doesn't matter to me at all. And I assume it doesn't matter to you either if you need to leave at 10 o'clock or 10:10 and you're a little afraid that you're going to be disruptive. Put that fear aside and come for the amount of time that you can be here. So, what are we doing this year? For the first time in many years, I don't know how many years, certainly not the last two, we're going back to the Torah portion of the week. Several of you have asked for this in recent months, and I think it's time to do it. One of the things that a great tradition features is review. Going back over familiar territory, the pleasure of familiarity, as well as, it seems to me that familiarity makes us comfortable enough with the text that we're willing to find more in it. More nuances, more depth, other ideas. So this notion of going back over it over and over again has a variety of important functions, and so that's what we're going to do this year. So we begin the cycle of Torah readings right after Simchat Torah, and not before. September 10th is not the magic date for starting the Torah portions. So this year, the beginning of the Torah readings doesn't take place until October 22nd. And on October 22nd, we will do the first portion, Bereshit, and move on from there. So this gives us 5 weeks by my count. First of all, we're not meeting next week. I'm going to be out of town, so our next meeting will be on the 24th. So we have today, September 24th, October 1, 8, and 15 to do a variety of other things. You have these packets. We are going to be going through them. I think they're some rich materials. Some of you have been through many of these before, but not for a long time. And I've added a couple of things that we haven't had before. So what we're going to do is kind of get an overview of things, and I hope I won't be doing all the talking. I have a feeling that that's not likely anyway. That, of course, we're here to have discussions and to reason and argue with one another, which is always part of the joy of it. But what I think we'll do along the way is pick up the Torah portions for those weeks before we start again. And that means that we're going to be dealing with the last chapters of the 5th of 5 books of Moses, the book of Deuteronomy. This week's Torah portion, Kitetse L'Milchama, when you go out to war, begins in the 10th verse of Deuteronomy 21. Okay? So we are right now in the 21st chapter of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy has 34 chapters. So over the subsequent weeks, we're going to be looking at parts of those final chapters, which I think raises an interesting idea. So there is this notion in philosophy with the word teleology. Teleology is the doctrine of purposes. What is the purpose of any given activity? One of my favorite examples of this is the idea of, here we have a baby, and next to the baby is a rock. Who are we going to be talking to? We're not going to talk to the rock, not only because the rock doesn't have any understanding whatsoever, but the rock is not going to be subject to development. We talk to a baby with the idea in mind at some point, more or less, that the baby is a full human being on the way to development. So we talk to the baby or the young child as if this child is going somewhere, going toward the capacity to speak and to hear and to reason. That would be a teleological view of infants. Where are they going, and how should we deal with them at any given moment with the goal in mind? So that we can understand beginnings if we have some conception of the end. The end in two senses. The final act or the culmination of a process. Okay? So I like the idea, maybe you'll disagree with me, that one of the advantages of not having the Torah portion of the week starting with Genesis is that if we look at the end of the 5 books of Moses, then when we go back to the beginning, we will have some view of where the 5 books of Moses is going. What are its tendencies? What are its goals? And we know that what happens at the very end is essentially a series of addresses by Moses, according to Deuteronomy. And Moses is trying to prepare the people for their life in the land of Israel. That is where they are going, right? Now, the book of Deuteronomy ends just before they get there. Moses is going to die. And when we get to the book of Joshua, the 6th book, the book that follows Deuteronomy, we finally do get there. So we have a kind of conundrum, a paradox about the end of Deuteronomy. It is building momentum for the climax, crossing the Jordan and getting into the promised land. We can taste it. And then it stops and doesn't get to the final act. So where is the 5 books of Moses going? I might say it's going toward 2 climaxes: completion and incompletion, both of which are crucial ideas, right? Completion, of course, rounds the arc off, and we love to round it off and get to our goal. We don't give that idea up. On the other hand, life is not like that. So often our endeavors, what about the scope of our lives? Here's how I put it. We all die before our to-do list is completely checked off. Or if we check off everything on the list, we definitely know we could have more elements on that list, which we're not going to get to do. So a book that is determined to tell the truth has to lay out in front of us two realities: the possibility of completion and the reality of incompletion. And that's where the Torah ends, on just at the brink of the Jordan River. But they don't go over, and Moses can't go over. So what story does the Torah tell to bring to dramatic life those two realities that are in tension with one another? If the Torah, a story is too idealistic, the finality of incompletion seems to be gratuitous. We were not prepared for it, because the Torah is a happily ever after story. And therefore, the incompleteness of the end doesn't work. If the Torah is pessimistic and tells us that all endeavors are going to run aground, and that the world, our environment, the universe, does not support human striving, then the imminence of going into the promised land itself doesn't make sense. The promised land. The land promised by elements of preceding books. And if the Torah is too pessimistic, it can't make sense of the real optimism contained in the notion of getting into the promised land, which of course we know is not the end, because once the Israelites get into the promised land, the issue of what is the promise of the promised land? Is it just physical, spatial, temporal arrival, or is the promise something deeper, something more complex? So the Torah has to tell a story that is both optimistic and also realistic about why is incompletion such an important part of our lives. Is it in the nature of things? Is it in human nature? Is it in the problems of interaction among members of a family or a community? So to understand how the Torah ends, which we're going to do, may give us some, let me call it, anticipatory clarity about where the Torah is going from the start. I take it, and maybe I'm wrong about this, I probably am wrong, that authors have some sense about where they're going. I think of myself in terms of writing sermons or divrei Torah. I often don't know where I'm going until I start going there. And about 5:15 on the Fridays I'm giving out of our Torah, I start panicking. So sometimes the ending is not clear from the start, it's emergent, and sometimes you do have some sense about it. So that's what we're going to be doing in the weeks that come. So on the 24th, we're going to be looking at Nitzavim, which is Deuteronomy 29, 9 through 30, 20, and you're going to have a chart here that'll tell you where we are. One of the interesting things about the length of Torah portions is that at the beginning the Torah portions are quite long. The first portion of Genesis is 5+ chapters. The second is 6+ chapters. Nitzavim, that portion, is 1 chapter. The next one after that is 1 chapter. So also we have an analogy, a musical analogy, that as it gets to the end, it slows down. There's a kind of retard as it arrives at or elevates the tension about getting there. If the fourth last portion were as long as the first portion of the Tanakh, we'd get there quickly. But since the Torah devotes less and less space to the portions, we are slowing down. And what's the function of that, we might ask. Okay, so let's take a look at these sheets. Feel free to interrupt me, of course, at any time with comments or questions. Let's just take a little look at what is contained in this packet, and then we'll go back. So the first couple of pages, first 3 pages, notice it's on front and back, I offer some analysis of different kinds of blessing. Okay? And my own marks on page 1, A and B, and then you'll see on page 2, at the very top, there's A, there's M, so I add another component, and so on. And finally, we'll get to, at the bottom of page 3, our blessing for the study of Torah, which I'll talk about, which we do every week, introducing ourselves every single week. On page 4, we have a chart of the books of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Scriptures, and we're going to spend some time with that. On page 5 is a comparative chart of the books of the Hebrew Scriptures known to Christian traditions as the Old Testament. And you can see numbers at the very top, circled number 1, circled number 2, you see them? Is the chart of the Hebrew Scriptures. Then 3 is the Protestant Bible, and 5 is the Roman Catholic Bible. So some comparative understanding of the contents and the shape, not only the contents, but the shape of biblical books, I think is interesting. On page 6, we have all the Torah portions of the week, beginning in Genesis and ending at the end of Deuteronomy. And there are 54 of them, okay? And the number in each, 12, 11, 10, 10, 11. Genesis has 12 portions, Exodus 11, Leviticus and Numbers each have 10 portions, and Deuteronomy 11. So that Genesis gets most of the largest number of Torah portions, which is curious because in a way the book of Genesis, as exciting as it is a prologue. It's a prologue to the Exodus from Egypt and all that the deliverance of freedom requires and offers. Okay? And I don't know exactly why that is, but it is interesting. 54 Torah portions always raises a question. There are 52 weeks of the year. We need extra portions for a leap year. You may know that a leap year in the Jewish calendar is not the addition of one day every 4 years, except the century, because we get too far ahead and we have to back up a little bit, or the other way around. But the addition of an extra month, 7 out of every 19 years. And that makes sense in a way that when we get to the portion of Noah we'll talk about. So when we add a month, we need extra Torah portions, which the addition of just 1 week wouldn't require. You can see over to the right there all the Haftorah portions. I don't know about you, for the first 18 years of my life, I thought the Haftorah meant half a Torah. I had no idea what half a Torah was, but for the first 18 years of my life, I didn't care. So I didn't pursue it. So the Haftorah comes from the Hebrew word that means completion. So the Haftorot complete the Torah portion. And they give another occasion for doing more of the Bible than just the 5 books of Moses. Okay? And every Haftorah portion complements in one way or another its corresponding Torah portion. So, for example, the first portion, Bereshit, in the beginning, Genesis 1, chapter 1, verse 1 through 6, verse 8. Let's pause on that for a minute. Some of you aren't used to this terminology. Let's look at that. 1:1 means chapter 1, verse 1. A verse is a sentence. Sometimes the sentences are arbitrarily divided. They could be divided in other ways. But at some point in the history of the biblical text, a group known as the Masoretes solidified certain elements of the text. They gave it vowels, or at least they made the vowels, what we call vocalization, fixed. There were already oral traditions about it. And they also divided verses syntactically. They told us what the end of each verse was. They told us where the middle was, the commas, the semicolons. These are things that don't happen in the text. But the vocalization marks help us with that. So now these are traditional ways of dividing chapters and verses. 1:1, chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 6, verse 8. And that means that the next week we're going to begin with chapter 6, verse 9, right? The next verse, which goes through chapter 11, verse 32. 32 is the last verse of chapter 11, so it stands to reason that the next week we're going to be in chapter 12, verse 1, and so on. The corresponding Haftorah portion to the first Torah portion is from the prophet Isaiah. And in the prophet Isaiah, who wrote and lived many, many years after the chronological beginning of the Torah, the rabbis at some point, I'm not sure we know exactly how or when, placed a corresponding Haftorah portion. And Isaiah talks about creation. Isaiah is divided into 3 parts. First Isaiah, second Isaiah, third Isaiah. Second Isaiah, the Isaiah of the exile, is writing in the exile to the exiles with a message of hope. Chapter 40, the beginning of second Isaiah begins, Nachamu, Nachamu. Comfort, comfort ye my people. Second Isaiah is a prophet of comfort. And of course, if you think of what happens in the time of the exile, the time of darkness, right? The time of powerlessness to some degree. A prophet of hope is going to talk about the possibility of new light, new hope, namely, return to the land of Israel. Wouldn't it be easy to think of that process of return as a new creation? Just as God created the world out of darkness at the beginning, so is God now going to recreate the world out of the darkness of exile. So it makes sense to place Isaiah 42 corresponding to Genesis 1, which not only shows a thematic similarity, but also it displays something theological. There was a movement in the 17th and 18th century known as deism. Deism. Theism is the doctrine or the idea that the God of the universe continues to be active in history, interacting with people. The deist idea did not deny the reality of God, but because they wanted to harmonize theology with the rise of a powerful scientific method, and science methodologically can never appeal to any forces outside of nature. What if a scientist came out of his or her laboratory at the end of the day and said, I found it, I got the answer, and God gave it to me? That person, though nobody would doubt the integrity of that person's belief, would certainly call into question this person's understanding of science and the scientific method. Science works with forces and realities in nature and not outside of nature. That's just one of the methodological premises of science. A believer in God is under pressure to tell us what's the relationship between God and nature. And on the theistic understanding, God can come in and give us some miracles, interrupt the flow of nature, alter the course of nature. That's inimical to science. So the deists made the claim that God did do something powerful at the beginning. God created the world. And put into the world God created all the laws of nature, which scientists are now discovering, displaying, and trying to understand. So the deist God makes the deist view makes the claim that God did act in the universe at one point by creating it, and no longer. The second Isaiah undermines, or at least calls into radical question, the deist idea. I'm being a little anachronistic here. Isaiah didn't know anything about deism. All I'm doing is talking about what deism tried to do with the rise of science. Isaiah is showing us that God continues God's creative activity in nature and in history. God didn't just create the world at the beginning, as we might infer from Bereshit, if we didn't know more. And Isaiah is saying, no, God's creative activity continues. And it continued hundreds of years, thousands of years after the creation of the universe. And therefore, we can be hopeful that the God of the universe is with us still. That not only can we understand hopefulness in a macro sense, peoples interacting, but even in the sense of the individual. That perhaps God still hears my prayer. We went into the exile. What does the fact of defeat at the hands of the Babylonians mean? Their God is stronger than our God. We go into exile because our God was defeated by their God. And therefore we might believe maybe our religion has lost its power and meaning. Maybe we should become Babylonians. What Isaiah is saying is, don't give that up. Your defeat was not primarily an illustration of Babylonian power, but a sign of the punishment of the people who for all the centuries before didn't follow the ways of God. And that God is not ruthless. There is a term of punishment. But when that term is over, God is going to bring us a new day and a new creation. And we're going to come back again. God continues to work in the world. Notice one of the further implications of that. I use the example of a faucet. God turned the faucet on when God created the world. The faucet seemed to have gone off with the destruction and the exile. Oh no, the faucet is still running. God's returning the people from Babylonia. We need to know that the faucet, let's call that revelation, is never finally off once and for all. To our surprise in Babylonia, the faucet is still on. God is still active in the world, bringing something new. Now, This means that if we take the historical process seriously, there's always the possibility of new revelations. We can't just turn the faucet on and off as we want to. When we thought it was off, it's still on. This gives rise to new readings of the Old Testament, that the faucet still runs. New revelation in the life and the death of Jesus, of Muhammad, and so on. So a tradition that does not allow the faucet to ever be turned off also has to contend with new revelations and new religions. These are the further implications of Isaiah 42 as a complement to the creation story. Okay, if we counted Haftorah portions, and the Haftorah portions all come from the second section of the Bible, the histories and the prophets. Isaiah gets 15 Torah portions. So the overwhelming favorite of the rabbis. And if one were to ask what, according to Rabbinic Judaism, is the most important non-Torah book in the Bible, the Haftorah portions give us one decisive answer, the book of Isaiah. It's only one answer. Notice, by the way, that the distribution of Haftorah portions seems, in a sense, random. What does the Torah portion of the week correspond to? Can I find something? The death of Sarah. What the heck am I going to do there? Hey, there's also a very dramatic death later on, the death of the death of David. Let's have the death of David correspond to the death of Sarah. So they're searching for complementarity. But notice the Haftorah portions for Deuteronomy. Isaiah's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 of 11 Torah portions. The first Haftorah portion for Deuteronomy comes just before Tisha B'Av, the day of mourning in the Jewish tradition. And Isaiah chapter 1 is a chapter of chastisement. Every other Isaiah Torah portion comes from either 2nd or 3rd Isaiah. Nothing more in the first 39 chapters. The first 39 chapters of Isaiah the first Isaiah is a prophet of chastisement. The 2nd Isaiah is a prophet of hope. The 3rd Isaiah is contending with the return to the land. Most of those portions, Isaiah 40, 49, 54, 51, and 54, and then 55 at the end, are all 2nd Isaiah. So we have the first Haftorah portion corresponding to the day in the Jewish calendar of chastisement and mourning. And then all the rest of them, with a couple of exceptions, come from 2nd Isaiah, as we move from Tisha B'Av in August to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So the calendar reflects a move from mourning to hope. And the Haftorah portions are gathered in order to reflect that. See how fascinating that is? That's just this very subject of Haftorah portions. Page 7, the 5 Megillot, scrolls. And each of those books, and we'll see where they are in the order of biblical books when we come back to it, is read on a particular holiday and in the order of the holidays, right? Passover, April, let's just say that. Shavuot, June. Tisha B'Av, August. Sukkot, October. Purim, February, March. So you notice what kind of calendar is implied by what's the beginning, what's the first month according to this array of Megillot? What's the first month? April. Isn't that strange? Rosh Hashanah, the New Year, is in September. The New Year, paradoxically, takes place in the 7th month. if we count April the 1st. What this means is that we have a superimposition of one calendar over another. So our calendar is represented by two different calendars put together. One of them may reflect an early experience of the people, the other a Babylonian experience. I think the Babylonian year began in the fall. In any event, the order of these books is according to their use in Jewish life. So, what's the chronology of Scripture and tradition? We might think that Scripture always comes before tradition. Tradition is generated by Scripture. Here we find the reverse. Tradition generates something about Scripture, the order of the books. The order of the books is according to the traditional use of those books in Rabbinic Judaism, right? So that tradition is not only generated by Scripture, it generates Scripture in some ways or another. You see how interesting that is? Page 8. This is a kind of a complicated page, but I think it has, it makes an interesting point. That in 1948, scrolls were found in the caves at Qumran, close to Jericho. And in subsequent years, scrolls were found in other places than Qumran, down the west bank of the Dead Sea. Okay? The Dead Sea Scrolls aren't limited to Qumran. And lo and behold, the scrolls found in 1948 in Qumran, which were placed there sometime before 70 of the Common Era, when the Essene community was destroyed by the Romans. So, before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, our earliest manuscript evidence for the Bible was essentially in the year 900, 1000. The different codices, the different versions of the text by the Masoretes. The Dead Sea Scrolls pushed our historical understanding of the Bible back 1,000 years. And what we have here, table 20, biblical scrolls found at Qumran. And when we get here, we'll get here and do a little more detail on it. Look at all the biblical books represented at Qumran. 21 pieces of evidence, some of them just little bits of writing. From Genesis, 15 from Exodus, 30 from Deuteronomy. We can't draw too many conclusions from this, but one inference that tantalizes us is just in terms of the number of scrolls that represent different biblical books, may suggest which books of the Bible were deemed most important by the Qumran community. Genesis, Deuteronomy, Isaiah. And we have this business here near the top, the square script and the Paleo-Hebrew, which we can talk about. On page 9, we have an example from the Dead Sea Scrolls which solve a traditional problem in understanding the Bible, and we'll get to that. So this is a good example of the use of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which essentially here supplies more of a story than we have in our Bible. In other words, there was a scroll which contained what we would call the whole story, whereas the Bible that we have only contains a fraction of the story. Wouldn't we like to know more? And we do know more from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Page 10. So something that we're going to want to think about. Just bring a couple of passages which talk about the fact-truth distinction. And this, of course, gets to something quite fundamental in our understanding of the Bible. Did Abraham live? Did God give the Torah on Mount Sinai? Did the Israelites wander through the desert? These are all factual questions. The question here is, let's suppose we decided that there are no facts, just to be extreme about it, corresponding to the biblical narrative. None of it is factual. Does this doom the Bible to irrelevance? Or is there something that complements or might be even seen to replace the facts, known as the truth? And these passages raise that issue. And then finally, page 11 and 12, some biblical chronology over and against other things happening in the ancient Near East. So that if you're interested in just getting a sense of where things are positioned, where certain books of the Bible came to be, where the patriarchs and Moses are, what else is going on, look at the Middle Eastern history column. See, go to the very top and come down 2/3. The rise of Assyria. See it? That happens in history. And it also affects biblical history itself. That continues on page 12. Page 13, I just bring some issues of what are the features of a scripture from Robert Alter's interesting book that I mentioned there. And then on page 14, just an overview of Jewish literature, the Bible through the Haggadah. Okay? Some of this you may want to look at on your own. So let's go back to page 1. I'm doing all the talking here. Any questions, comments? So, yeah, please.
If there are so many books that were discovered from Isaiah, why is there a first, second, third Isaiah?
Good question. Why is there, and for the sake of those who are live streaming, I hear this all the time, we didn't understand the question, so I'm going to try to repeat the questions, not only for our own sake, but for those who are live streaming. And if I rush right away to a response, remind me that I need to repeat the question. Why are there so-called 3 Isaiahs? So, I think that it's fair to say that there are 3 periods of the understanding of Isaiah. The first period goes from the beginning to maybe the 17th century. There are no 1, 2, and 3 Isaiahs. They're just the book of Isaiah. Let's call that the period of W, wholeness. Then there's a period begun essentially by Spinoza and Thomas Hobbes, where they begin to examine the Bible critically. Spinoza says somewhere in his Tractatus that we should treat the Bible as the book of the Bible as we treat the book of nature. And we should apply rational principles to the understanding of the Bible. And that begins thinking about the history of the biblical text and its meaning. And it became somewhat clear to these people that from chapters 1 through 39 deals with the issue of chastisement. This must mean that the so-called first Isaiah is still living before the Babylonian exile when he's trying to get the people at long last to repent. He's chastising in order to encourage teshuvah, repentance. When we get to chapter 40 through 55, we see a very different mood. It's the mood of compassion and hopefulness. This must, they assumed, come from a different hand, at a different period, in a different context. This is the Isaiah of the exile. These 2 authors, first Isaiah so-called and second Isaiah, could not be the same person. Now, beginning with chapter 56,
we have yet another context. The people have come back, and now they are faced with different problems, different challenges. So this must be, look, the exile it goes from 586 to 540, something like that. King Cyrus announces the possibility of return, and the people return. And they build the third temple from 539 on. Maybe I have this a little wrong, but this can't be either the first Isaiah or the second Isaiah. It's a totally different set of circumstances. And I dare say that scholars of the language of the book of Isaiah note not only contextual differences, but aesthetic differences, ways of writing, vocabulary. You may one guy's supposed to graph what I say in a given morning, and you probably will recognize some patterns, certain phrases, certain words. If I'm struggling to what word comes next, I revert to a favorite of mine. You get another person up here to do this, you'll have a whole different lexicon of words. And I take it that that analysis has been done. I don't know anything about it. Period 1, there's only one Isaiah, 1 through 66. Period 2, from Spinoza to, I would say, the last 15, 20 years, the assumption was, the conclusion is, there are 3 Isaiahs. Starting with, what's his name? A guy at Yale, Christopher somebody, who begins to return to the assumption that really these are not 3 distinct authors, but there are continuities in the book of Isaiah, which second Isaiah uses some of the language or the ideas that the first Isaiah does. So that the notion of 3 distinct Isaiahs begins to be challenged. I don't know that scholarship has arrived at, or whether there's a movement for claiming back to period 1. It's all by one guy. But there is a resistance to 3 separate Isaiahs. So that 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Isaiah is a scholarly assumption which has lasted because there's lots of evidence. But it's not the final word. When are we going to get the final word? Never. That's part of the excitement of scholarship, isn't it? We keep discovering new things. The questions we ask at a certain period of time open up different realities. What the answers are depends to some degree on what the questions are. And the questions change. Let me use a baseball analogy. The question up until 5 years ago was, for pitchers, how do I pace myself to finish the game? How can I throw full 9-inning game? You may know in the early history of baseball, most pitchers completed games. There's a famous guy, Iron Man Joe McGinnity, who pitched and won both ends of a doubleheader 3 times in one season. That can't happen. That's not going to happen anymore. The question the pitchers are asking now is, the starting pitcher, how can I last 5 innings? The bullpen, of which there was none up until maybe the 40s, is I got to be ready now. I got to be ready now. So the questions that are asked, how can I do X, lead to different kinds of answers. Okay, so that's kind of a response to that. Isaiah studies, I haven't kept up with them at all, but are very fascinating. Okay, so let's just take a look here at page 1. This doesn't have to do with Torah study per se, but since we are doing a blessing every time we start Torah study, it's useful to know something about the shape and shapes of different brachot, different blessings. So the first one, I divide into part A, Baruch atah Adonai. Hebrew readers can read to the right, but it's also transliterated. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. That's a constant form of blessings. Okay? And you can see blessing 2 has A, blessing 3 has A, blessing 4 has A, and so on. B is what the blessing is all about. Praised are you, blessed, source of blessing, it says here. Eternal our God, you fill the universe with majestic might. All right. Praised are you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe. Okay? Well, that's a generalization. That's a general introduction. Doesn't tell us yet what we're saying thank you for. You gave us life. Praised are you because of B, what you did for us. Second blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, A, borei pri hagafen, who creates the fruit of the vine. That's what we're doing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam doesn't tell us what we're doing. It's only the lead-in, the premise. Notice that this is not Asher Kitshana b'mitzvotav, who sanctifies us by his commandments, because this evidently is not a commandment. So we're just praising God, or we're thanking God. These are prayers of praise and thanks. At the bottom, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, she'asani b'tzelemi, for you created me in your image. Okay? Page 2. Page 2 adds a middle phrase. A is there. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. We praise you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe. Asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav. B'mitzvotav means in his commandments. But inside that word is mitzvot, commandment. Ba, with, or in. The last av is a suffix, his. Who has sanctified us with his commandments. V'tzivanu. That's the verb. V'tzivanu is a cognate of mitzvot. A mitzvah is a noun. A command is a verb. Who commanded us? So now we're responding to a commandment, to an obligation. What is that obligation? To eat matzah. The next one. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Here's your M term. Asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu. You see that's a constant phrase. And then why we're doing it. Alachilat maror, who commands us to eat bitter herbs. The candles at the bottom. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu. Asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu. So A is a constant, M is a constant, but M doesn't appear in all blessings, only commandment blessings. I can thank God for the fruit of the vine, for bread. That's not a commandment, that's a thank you. Asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, what? B, lahadlik ner shel Shabbat, commands us to kindle the lights of the Sabbath. I get a little fancier here on page 3, which it didn't come out, but there's the A term. Blessed are you, Lord of God, King of the universe, who has chosen us from among all the nations and has given us the Torah. Blessed are you who gives the Torah. I guess I feel that B sub 1, some of a variation of something. I didn't look at it, but something like that. I outfancied myself. And finally, the blessing for the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav, M, la'asok v'divrei Torah, commands us what? To occupy ourselves with words of Torah. And that's the blessing we say every week. So you can see that blessings follow certain patterns, and depending upon what kind of blessing they are. The She'echiyanu doesn't have Asher Kidshanu b'mitzvotav, because this is a thank you blessing. Praise you, sovereign, it's kept us alive. I'm not God isn't asking me to do anything. I don't have any obligation there. I'm just reaching out of my own gratitude. Okay? So the whole business of blessings, I think, is quite fascinating. Before we say the blessing and then move on, let me just say, so what needs explaining in any blessing? The B term. The B term is what we're doing. La'asok b'divrei Torah. Whoever made up this blessing for the study of Torah is a genius, I think, because this tells us what the study of Torah is all about. What is it for? It's not for arriving at consensus. It's not for creating in us certain doctrines and dogmas. Take them or leave them. And if you leave them, you're not a part of the normative community. The Bible as a book of propositions or of commands, or a book that requires consensus. Of course one just needs to look at the book to know it's not requiring consensus, because there's no consensus in the Bible itself. Just pit book of Job against the book of Deuteronomy, and you can't reconcile the two ideas. So what does the study of Torah, what is it for? It's for occupying ourselves with an endeavor, with an activity. Take it seriously as individuals and as a community. Because by doing so, you may arrive at some wisdom for your lives, and you certainly can arrive together you can arrive together through an activity. That's what la'asok suggests, an activity. Occupy yourselves with that. And when we occupy ourselves with it together, given that the Torah is, let me put it this way, a wide open book, that's probably overstated, all of our views and opinions and needs can be found there. So we find ourselves in the Torah, and each of us is different and has different ideas and different aspirations. But we're all included. If the Torah had the form, these are the 10 things you must do in order to be a good Jew or a good Christian or a good Muslim. These are what you need to do. I don't want to do these things. These things are not the life I want to lead. Don't come to Torah study then. Because the Torah study is a book of do's and don'ts, may include and may exclude. But the Torah study as a sort of a broad palimpsest, palimpsest, I think, if I got this right, is the text that can be discovered underneath the layers of texts. So you dig down to the palimpsest. The Torah is a palimpsest on which we write our own story. We don't just write it because we need that story. We write it in interaction and conversation with the Torah. The Torah presents and we respond. Or we bring our questions and we see whether the Torah can tell us anything about it. This whole notion of occupying ourselves raises an interesting question. I have 24 hours in a day. I've got to occupy myself with time. How many of those 24 hours, let's cut out sleep, 16 hours a day. How many of those days does this blessing of those hours require of us? Well, we might say to occupy yourselves means all of it. Think about Torah, all your waking hours. That can't be what's at. That's superhuman, isn't it? Only Torah scholars who are supported by others can do that. There is what I like to call overt awareness and covert awareness. And my example is always my children. I don't think about my children every waking hour overtly. What's on your mind right now? My children. No, I mean several times during the day, the answer to that question is something else. Preparing a Devar Torah, meeting with a family, preparing for a funeral or a wedding. So I like to think that what this requires is a covert awareness. Not that it's on my mind consciously, but it's a part of who I am. It's a part of the cultivation of certain values and aspirations which guide me sometimes without my consciously thinking about them. Who am I? It's the issue of character. Might be the issue of character versus personality. Personality is how I present myself to others. Character is who I am. Let's hope that I'm honest. But I'm not aware of being honest every moment, but hopefully when there's an opportunity to be dishonest, to fudge honesty a little bit, hopefully who I am guides me away from the violation of a virtue which I like to continue to cultivate. And I think that's it. That Torah should be, in a sense, the background, sometimes the foreground, but the background of who we are. And of course, Torah can lead to a variety of things. Okay, let's say the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe, who sanctifies us through God's commandments, enjoining upon us the obligation to make Torah study our obligation, or to immerse ourselves in the study of Torah. Okay, so let's go on a little bit. Page 4. So here we have, and some of you know this very well and some don't. Oh, by the way, I do want to say to those who are live streaming, so obviously I've passed out a packet today. By definition, you don't have it. What I'm going to try to do is to provide my assistant Cindy Wilson with any handout that I give during our weeks together. If you're interested in getting that handout, call Cindy Wilson or write to her, cwilson@ttti.org, 3 T's and an I, and just tell her to email you a packet. Sometimes I'll be able to get it to her days in advance. So if you anticipate that I'm passing something out, you might write to her and ask her to send it to you. Some days I will only get it to her as of this episode, only after the session where we're using it, though we're going to go on with this, but she'll send it to you. Sometimes, in other words, I get it to her before, sometimes I get it to her after, sometimes I'm going to totally forget. And when that happens, you could write to her, but she won't have anything. Okay, I hope this works. And by the way, those of you who are live streaming, let me know if it works, if this is a satisfactory way of getting you the materials that we're using. Okay, so we have in front of us a sheet of the books of the Bible and the structuring of the books of the Bible. The first thing to note is one of the names of the Bible is Tanakh. There's the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew Scriptures, the Bible from the Jewish point of view. But another way is to call it a Tanakh. Now the Hebrew, that is off to the right and above the word Tanakh, 3 letters which stand for the 3 sections of the Bible. And you can see them listed right below the word Tanakh. Torah, Nevi'im, which means prophets, and Ketuvim, which means writings. And if you take the first letter of each of those 3 words from the left, T-N-K, you get Tanakh. The K sound at the end of a syllable is softened from K to Ch. Well, if it were a kuf, it wouldn't be, but this is not a kuf, it's a kaf. A little technicality. So Tanakh becomes Tanakh. Okay, so you can see Tanakh is, I think the word is an acronym, a made-up word on the basis of the first letter of the words in that cluster. Tanakh, and also across the right for Hebrew readers, Tanakh, Tav, Nun, Kaf, Ketuvim. Okay, so the word Tanakh already tells us what the overall structure of the Hebrew Scriptures is. 3 parts. And now, below, we have those 3 parts. 1, you see my circle letter numbers, Torah. 2, off to the right, Nevi'im, prophets. 3, bottom left, Ketuvim. So those are the books arrayed in those 3 sections. Torah, the 5 books of Moses. Every Torah scroll contains all those 5 books and only those 5 books. So it's false to say that some scrolls contain the whole Tanakh. No scroll does. We have 13 scrolls, the temple. I mean, we're very wealthy in that regard. And each and every scroll has only the 5 books of Moses. From creation to, I might say, death. The last episode in the book of Deuteronomy, in the Torah, is the death of Moses. And a sort of eulogy for Moses. None arose like Moses ever again. How'd the author know that, by the way? No one ever arose again like Moses. That is a what's the word to say? This is a premise of the author. It's not an empirical conclusion. The author can't know that. By saying no one ever arose again, by the way, let me just ask you this question. What are the implications of saying that as a kind of doctrine, as a kind of dogma? What are the implications of that?
It was written,
I'm sorry?
it was decided long after.
He was...
Actually, it hasn't been decided.
It has not been... It can't be an empirical claim.
Right.
It's a dogmatic, it's a doctrinal claim. What's the doctrine? What are the implications of saying that?
You can predict the future.
I'm sorry?
That you could predict the future.
Yet that you can't predict I see what you're saying. Yeah, and how credible is that? It isn't. That can't be what a thoughtful author has in mind. The author doesn't know this. I'm going to tell you, I'm going to look at my crystal ball. If the author said to us, we say to the author, we have the author. What did you mean by that? It means that I predict the future. How do you predict the future? I've got a crystal ball. I'm not going to read that author's book. That author is a unprofound author. That's why I'm making the claim. How do I know? Maybe the author did feel that I can predict the future. I think there are really 2 basic doctrinal ideas there. Nobody ever again, in normative terms, will ever be on Moses' level. What Moses brought is uniquely preeminent. The 5 books of Moses is the normative center of biblical religion. I, the author, am claiming that. You can reject it, you can say no, but that's the claim I'm making. Nobody rises to Moses' level, and therefore nothing literary rises to the level of the 5 books of Moses. That's the end of the first rung of the normative ladder. That's where you're going to find it. That's what the author is asserting. Gary?
Well, I think that's true from the Jewish point of view, but I think the Christian and Muslim faiths would not agree with that.
That's true. Yeah, that's exactly right. So what Gary is saying is, and that's, I think, one of the implications of calling this a norm and not an empirical result, is that it's an assertion. It's a powerful assertion, and maybe, our tradition has essentially bought it, but it's true. It's just an assertion. As a matter of fact, one could find, if one wants to, elements in the 5 books of Moses that point beyond not only the 5 books of Moses, but the entire Bible. There is something, Doris, you could help me here, but I can't even think of it, that points to the arrival of Jesus. Something about there will come. You remember, Doris, what that is? No. But, so, one could even agree with the author that this is the norm, but also posit that the norm, what's normative, is not fully known except through interpretation. And interpretation is often guided by events. And events may reveal a new understanding of something in the 5 books of Moses. So we're still faithful to the 5 books of Moses, but it reveals to us something new that we didn't anticipate. In any event, to make that claim is to elevate the status of 5 books of Moses and Moses himself. Stuart?
Is the translation of that accurate?
Well,
Did it say no one has ever?
Yes, yeah, right. Well, let's just be sure I'm right about saying that. So we're looking at the end of Deuteronomy. So, verse 10 of chapter 34. Lo kam navi od, never again arose. Isn't that the translation? Lo kam navi od b'Yisrael ka like Moses. Asher yida'o Adonai, whom God knew, panim el panim, face to face.
Okay.
And this is also an assumption that only Moses saw God face to face. And therefore, Maimonides takes that to mean that Moses had intellectual converse with God. Maimonides doesn't think it's to be meant literally face to face, but his mind and God's mind were one. In other words, what Moses wrote down is what God delivered. Moses acted as a stenographer through whom the word of God came. That's a powerful idea, which I take it we resist. Maya?
But if you follow that, that means that it doesn't exclude the fact that there might be somebody who is going to surpass Moses.
Lo kam navi od, ever again?
Right. Well, I don't know. It's kind of...
Again. Maybe again, but not never again.
Right.
Is that your idea?
Right.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Malcolm?
So your translation of the words, as you just repeated, is projecting to the end of time.
Yeah.
Which is endless.
Right.
I don't find troubling this language if we accept that the 5 books are divinely inspired.
Yes, yes.
So the author is just a mouthpiece for the Word of God.
Yeah.
So I'm taking on faith the Word of God that there will never be someone like Moses again.
Right. So Malcolm is suggesting that if you accept kind of a literal version of Revelation, the very words and sentences of God, rather than inspiration. Yeah, I mean, I think we all agree that Beethoven was inspired. Let's take the 5th Symphony. That's a product of inspiration. Did God write the 5th Symphony? Here's how I want you to start, Ludwig. Da, 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 da. Write it down. Right. Don't forget, write it down. No. So there's inspiration and there's also literal revelation. And one could say inspired without the words themselves. But if you assume the stricter view of Revelation, that these are the very words and letters, then you accept this. Maya is opening the possibility that ode, again, need not mean never, ever, ever again. And that's another interpretation of it. You know, once the Hebrew is fixed early in the rabbinic period, then the Masoretes, one of the things the Masoretes do in the 9th century, is to fix the text. They count words and letters. At the end of each book, you have how many words there are in this book, what's the middle letter, what's the middle word, what's the point of that? To be sure that subsequent copies are faithful to the original copy. Because as we know in the history of transmission, there are 2 ideas here. Torah min ha-shamayim, the Torah from heaven, and Torah Moshe, the Torah of Moses. So one claim the rabbis are making is the Torah from heaven is the Torah that Moses wrote down, and that without error down through history has been faithfully preserved. That makes us very skeptical. If I'm copying a letter to somebody, I'm making a mistake in the copying. How much the more so over 4,000 years? But the Masoretes are trying to preserve the integrity of transmission. So there's the question of what is it that God, taking revelation, gave us, literal or figurative, and the whole issue of transmission, which, in the transmission of anything, history is corrosive. And how do we resist that? Jim?
But that line, never before, never again, is a subtle implication, I think. They're not telling you that Moses was some superhuman being.
Right.
They're just saying there's not going to be another person
Right.
with those attributes. It doesn't negate the fact there won't be other great people
Right.
with other attributes. And I think it's important, particularly as we go towards Christianity, the subtlety that this is not a superhuman being. It's another human being with extraordinary attributes.
Right. I think it's a good point. That's one of the things we say about the fact that the Torah does say nobody knows where Moses was buried. So we can't make it a shrine, so we can't think of Moses as a superhuman individual. It's the people, it's the process. Yeah, although Maimonides thinks that Moses is the greatest person who ever lived, who was able to combine great philosophical acumen with great political virtues. So Moses is the greatest philosopher and the greatest, let's say, politician, statesman. So Maimonides makes that claim about Moses, which you're saying is not implicit in this at all. Moses is great, he did great things, but he's not necessarily the greatest person. Etty?
I think that the writer writes it, when he writes it in the early rabbinic period, he has a perspective of 1,000 years or so past Moses. And in these, and he knows history, and he knows that there was never anybody even coming close to Moses. So he makes a projection that there will never be. I think it's legitimate, it's based on his experience.
So the distinction here is between an empirical claim and a doctrinal claim. And I've tried to make the case that it can't be a legitimate empirical claim. Its essence is doctrinal. So Maya has come to challenge that a little bit, and you're challenging it too, that the person who wrote this has some justification in making that prediction, right? Yeah. He doesn't know the future, but he can certainly, with some knowledge, predict it. So, great. I mean, I find myself fascinated by the effort because it does have great resonance and power down through history. Why is it that Torah scrolls have only the 5 books of Moses? Because of what we just read here in the Torah. Nobody ever rose like Moses again. So any scribe who adds the book of Joshua to a Torah scroll doesn't reckon, I don't know what to say about it. You get the point, though. It's not that this person is a heretic or aberrational, maybe on the way. That's a good question. I'm going to hire a scribe to add the book of Joshua. If you promise, don't tell anybody who was behind it. Okay, very good, very good. So, all right, here we go. So, okay, I think maybe we'll stop. Oh, yeah, Maida?
I have difficulty thinking of Moses.
Talk louder, please.
I have difficulty thinking of Moses as the greatest, when I know who all was behind him and who supported him and who helped him become, and who was literally his right hand. I mean, he had his brother, he had his sister, and these were very strong people who supported him, and I don't see him as the only.
Yeah.
I see him as being supported by people who helped him be and speak, but who, without whom he might not have been who he is being praised to be.
So, Einstein is not the only scientist.
Right.
But don't you think that if we're talking about, I don't know, relativity, it's Einstein. Of course he had others, but doesn't somebody...
Right there with a lot of those same ideas. So.
Yeah. I mean, your point is unassailable, really, because we're always doing what we do in the presence of others. We always help other people. So none of us really exists, our accomplishments don't exist in a vacuum. So you're absolutely right. On the other hand, one can talk about a singular individual, and also, since the implications of asserting Moses' uniqueness are great, those implications, that the Torah is it, and that no other prophecy is going to be able to bring something comparable to the Torah. Those help to ground communities in a clear way. And so there is a doctrinal, poetic, rhetorical, rhetoric is about persuasion. How can I be persuaded that the 5 books of Moses is singular? There are 2 ways. Take a look at it. Okay, I looked at it last night. No, look at it further. So there's an interesting question about what makes a book have the reputation it has. One is from where it came. The other is to where does it go. The other is what is it? Past, present, future. The Bible is sacred because God wrote it. For those for whom that's true, that's it. That's enough. What makes the Bible so singular? What did it lead to? It led to great world religions that continue to live it and ponder it. Well, yeah, Don Quixote. Yeah, Don Quixote, great. But I don't sing Don Quixote's the verses at the Shabbat table or Thursday night. So where it came from, what it leads to, are 2 criteria for attempting to make the claim that this is singular. Also, what it is. Read it. Heschel makes the point that the Bible isn't sacred. We don't say that God was behind the Bible because God was behind the Bible. Just read the Bible. And you will see that it's not outrageous to say God was behind it. Think of the wisdom and so on. These are all questionable claims. But doesn't a tradition require some assertions that are ultimately questionable, maybe even false, to give a foundation to the structure? You know the cement that you used at the base of the terminal tower? It's not the best cement. Use a different kind of... Yeah, but the thing still stands. So it must be good enough. Let me just go for it. It must be the best. So it's all false empirically and rationally. But it does raise the question of whether or not there needs to be assertions that, if not absolutely foolproof, are strong enough to give durability. to a tradition. Yeah, Moses had a lot of help, but Moses was the greatest. Let's say it. Moses had a lot of help. All right, Leviticus. I mean, if he had a lot of help, maybe he nodded when he wrote Leviticus. No, Moses didn't nod. Leviticus is one of the great books. So he had help, but if you say he had help and therefore he wasn't this and that and so on, is never again arose Moses. Oh, come on, you don't know that. I think I'll spend my time Saturday morning reading Dostoevsky, which would be useful, but it wouldn't bring us together in some way. Here, Friday night, Yom Kippur, Shabbat, all of those things have weight for a lot of reasons. But one of them is we accept in some way the premises. I would be raising my hand at this point if I heard somebody say what I just said. All right, it's a kick, isn't it? So we're not meeting next week, 2 weeks from today. Bring your sheets. I'll have more if you forget, and we'll continue to work our way through them. Wonderful discussion. Shabbat shalom. Here I had Emily Dickinson to read, and Noah.
Tell me, what's happening with Ellen and Nancy? Are they okay? Because I haven't seen them in the last 3 poetry meetings.
Yeah. No, they're fine. Okay. They're fine. Thank you. Good. Oh, I definitely will. Thank you very much. Good to have you here.
Speaking of Emily Dickinson, I went to my high school, my 50th reunion last weekend, and somebody gave me, it saved this for years, a first edition Emily Dickinson.
Wow.
Once I finish it, I'll loan it to you.
Oh, I'd love to see it.
Yes, I can't wait. And there's, in the foreword, there are some copies of the original manuscripts.
How great is that? Do you know who
It's
the
virtually
editors
unreadable.
were?
No, I don't.
If I told you, would you recognize?
I might.
Mabel Loomis Todd?
It was a new, no, that doesn't ring a bell. It was somebody, it was a very new discovery, like it was towards the end.
Oh, this must be what's his
In
name?
the 20s, I think.
Franklin.
Maybe.
Franklin.
Maybe, yeah, that sounds like a possibility. I know that he was mentioned there.
Oh, very good.
So,
Well, that's a treasure.
So a couple things I wanted to, some of them are trivial, like this. We had a guy who did pitch both games of a doubleheader several weeks ago, but they were only 7-inning games. But still, quite an accomplishment.
Oh, absolutely. Especially with time in between where you're on this career.
Yeah, I know. Why did you say that Deuteronomy and Job are sort of irreconcilable?
Well, Deuteronomy has a basic claim that you reap what you sow. If you do good things,
which was not the case, right? Okay,
which was questioned.
Very good, very good.
Because the friends come to console him, and they're essentially Deuteronomists.
Right.
Job says no.
Now, this is also just frivolous. When you mentioned hiring a scribe to add the book of Isaiah, the risk there is that, your other extension, Don Quixote, the next thing you know, Man of La Mancha might find its way into the Shabbat liturgy.
That's true. It's the whole question, for example, of canon.
Exactly. I was going to bring up canonization. This is a bold canonizing statement and it also excuses the statement that he was the most humble man who
Think of what happened in the medieval universities, like the University of Paris,
right.
where Aristotle's prestige needed representation, and it put pressure on the focus on theology and Bible.
Right.
So 2 canons so that was a crisis for the church.
Which Maimonides kind of resolved a bit there too, didn't he?
In what sense?
Didn't he brought Aristotle into the fold, sir?
Yes, and very controversial.
Yeah.
Very controversial.
I'll bet it was.
Sure.
That was a talk about taking a risk,
And there are modern scholars who take both sides of that question, that essentially Maimonides succeeded in reconciling the Bible.
I think so.
And there's some who say he's schizophrenic. He can't make a choice, and there are others who say he's a closet his true commitment was to Aristotle.
Somewhat.
And he was trying to find a way to make Aristotle work.
I could see that argument.
Absolutely.
Okay, listen, I don't want to monopolize your time.
Great to see you physically. You're playing.
Doing well, yeah. Semi-final game next Tuesday.
You made it through another season.
Yeah. Not without the help of my
Therapist.
orthopedic surgeon, yeah.
Yep, more and more. Sure. Nice to see you.
Everything is good. I could be younger for that sort of stuff.
That's great. You helped me weight down?
Well, I gained that 30 and 50 pounds that I lost. I didn't need to be 200 pounds. Maybe if I was 6'3", I'm really challenged that.
You don't look like you gained 30 pounds in the last couple of years.
No, I gained it back probably last September to maybe December, January, that sort of thing. And January was on a mission. I told I was on a mission. And I basically stayed the same, exercising 5 days a week. I traveled. I was in Chicago 3 weeks ago. I was in Minneapolis last week. Met, I think I told you, I just went into the Tony Weaver.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
He was the one guy, I think, who said he could get pretty out except Tony Weaver.
I don't know who that picture was. But there is, but I think I remember I introduced you to a friend of ours, named Howard Kidd, who was a bonus baby for the Yankees. So when I first met Tony about 4 years ago, I showed him a picture that we took at the show. Because Tony's a friend of mine, and he always comes to the show. He's a wonderful guy. I can't understand him, but he's a wonderful guy. And anyway, both of these guys, our friend was playing for the Yankees. He was allegedly a bonus baby. He was for the Yankees in 1959. And he and Tony were playing against each other. Howard from the Yankees, Tony from Minnesota. And he was pitching to him in Augusta, Georgia. Tony hit a fly ball the third out of the inning. The bat broke. And Howard picked it up, took it back, threw it in his locker. I told Howard about this, that I met Tony Oliva. And he said, wait right here. They live in Westchester County, Bedford, New York. He comes back from the garage, he brings me this bat. This is Tony Oliva. I have a picture of it, I'd show you.
Tony signed it?
No. So I told Tony about our friend who had the bat. And I showed him the picture of the bat like a year later. And then he said to me, he says, you tell your friend, I'll sign the bat. When I go into the Hall of Fame, it'll be worth a lot of money. Yeah, he'll do it.
Oh, how nice.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a
Great
good
story. How about that? Yeah. Great.
So your health is fine?
Yeah, so far, I mean, I'm getting MRIs now instead of CAT scans. And I'm getting another one at the end of, I think the end of October. And if everything is good, as the last one was, 8 weeks ago, they're going to give me a choice of some kind of medication. So, because I still go back to chemo every other week. And I don't mind that. I said to the doctor, I said, I don't have a problem with that. You got me to where I am. It's very doable. And I'm not traveling like I used to. I don't need to do that anymore. And just tell me where I'm supposed to be. Are you taking those home? So he said, it's always good to have options. They gave me a pill last summer.
When the staff puts them in, they wear gloves. I was thinking about that, actually.
So, it's obviously I'll listen. It's dumb for me not to listen.
Trying to be helpful.
I'm just incredibly happy where I am
That's
right
not
now.
until like the spring, January.
Just,
20 years ago.
How about 5? The point of the matter is that if we were to talk 18 months ago, I wouldn't give you 12 cents and I'd be talking to you today. Oh my God, the statistics, stage 4 pancreatic cancer is anywhere from 2 months to a year. People surviving 5 years is probably less than 5%, or something like that. I mean, it's astronomical.
Yes, they were, Sue probably said,
That
these
means
are
new
the.
things come
Oh,
online.
sure, yeah. You know, the longer you're alive, the more possibility of things that can happen.
So he probably came up with.
But this is, I don't take things too seriously. I mean, I take things a lot seriously, but I've finally figured out the world does not revolve around George Morris anymore. I mean, well, I do see things differently.
You have a perspective now.
Not that anything scare me.
Isn't that great? It's too bad that you have to go through this kind of crisis to get there, but anyway, I mean, it's hard to have that perspective.
Was that your grandmother?
I think you've always had a sense of realism,
I
humility.
did, only because of the fact that there's a lot of things I can't
Except he
control.
wanted to see you.
I gotta let the stupid
Except
stuff
he
go.
wanted to see you.
Yes. That'll, psychologically, the little stuff will bring you down, it really will. I've always been in a business where it's always about tomorrow, going forward, and not living in the
Now,
past.
that's great. We ought to try to find a way for the four of us to have dinner. Are you guys ready?
You tell me,
Okay, good.
yeah.
Maybe right after the holidays, we'll think about it.
That'd be great. Love to do it.
Oh, so would
Love
we.
to do it. It'd be
Great.
I'm sorry to meet you.
Oh, no, hey, say hi to Franny
I
for me.
will, me too, stay well.
Thanks a lot, George, thanks.
Thank you.
How are you?
I'm
Gosh.
fine, nice to see you.
How long has it been? 2.5 years easily. How things doing with you?
I'm still above the surface.
Yes, you are.
Okay, I'm still pushing myself. It's painful. Unfortunately, it looks like the surgeon damaged
Oh,
the nerve,
oh dear.
and this side is painful.
All the time?
Yeah, and no matter how much I do exercises, the muscles are.
Oh, boy.
That's okay.
Yeah, you can live with it.
I can live with this, and I'm going to live. I'm glad that I could make it today,
Yeah, it's great to see you.
and my grandson came to see me.
Oh, how great. Very
Yeah,
good.
he's with his father left.
Are you still working full-time?
Yeah.
Same as before?
Well, not that much, because the children take
Have
a
they-
little bit,
Okay.
and obviously, before 6, 7 o'clock, I was there. Now I'm waking up at 4, 5, at home. Then I'm going there, but I have to go for my therapy
Okay, every day?
3 times a week.
Okay.
And sometimes I feel that I can walk, but on average, on a daily basis, 2 miles together,
Okay.
in summary.
Good.
Uh,
How's Zoya doing?
Zoe is doing okay. She lost one of her dogs,
Oh, no.
but she does not allow to anyone to express condolences in a form of Greek mythology. You lost your child, you lost your baby. She said, no, I didn't lose my baby. That is a dog. That is an animal.
But we get attached to our animals, don't we?
They did the job what they supposed to. They came to give us joy
Yes.
and happiness.
Yes.
And they worked very hard on doing this. They did it. Goodbye. Thank you.
Oh, well, that's a very good way of looking at it.
It's only one way, but we still have the second one.
Oh, good.
He
Well, that's
is,
nice.
He
That's
is
good.
blind.
Oh.
He is arthritic. 2 of them came from the same litter. They're the same age. A little bit different.
Oh, that's interesting.
Okay,
It's just
that's
like the
all.
children,
Yeah.
raised by the same parents but different.
Yeah, but because of his condition, we cannot turn him to dog sitter and take off and go somewhere.
Okay.
And I'm not ready yet,
Okay.
because I cannot imagine sitting 4 hours on a plane, going international flights, 4 or 5.
You're not
And
doing
walk-
that anymore.
Right now, I'm not doing.
Are you hopeful that your therapist and exercises will help?
I hope that God's will
Yeah.
and my persistence will help.
Very good. Good combination.
Therapists can only move.
Yeah.
If somebody damaged with a scalpel or knife
Yep.
or
Yep.
scissors,
Yeah.
the medicine is not
That's the
there
truth.
to restore.
If it's an actual physical, yeah. Wow. Well,
Did it affect my mental? Yes and no,
uh-huh.
because when you're suffering from the pain and you have to take these painkillers, which I gave up, I threw them away, but it still has some impact,
I'm sure.
residue.
Good.
Question for you.
Yeah.
I was listening to all this interpretation of commentary.
Yeah.
There will be no Moses again.
Right.
And even my name is Moses, I'm not making claims.
Okay.
But I think, looking back in the history, which full of the stories of imposters, the king is not dead, that his child, that was, they hide him. Queen is, that was very clever idea to prevent any future possible imposters and dictators. Because Moses was not a dictator. Every time when he was giving commands, he said, God told me.
Yeah.
That's it, no more Moses.
That's it.
No more imposters.
I think that's a very, very good point. And what is and another thing to say about it is, but it didn't close down the activities of interpretation. So in a certain way, you could relativize Moses through your interpretations. In other words, this interpretation takes seriously Moses' uniqueness, but here's what I have to say. And
here's what I have to say. My name is Moses. I believe in the power of naming the child.
Yes.
The God told me I cannot go to Israel.
That's funny.
And I never had a chance to cross Jordan River and go there.
So
maybe one day, next year in Israel.
Next year in Israel. Well, I'm
You're
hoping next
looking
year in
good.
Cleveland. Well, thank you. I'm trying.
Okay, and are you traveling?
A bit, not much though, a bit. I mean, we are driving to Boston this coming week for a wedding, and I meet with my brother, but other than that, we don't do much. Jackie's working full-time.
That is good for her.
Absolutely.
It's good for everyone.
When
you can work, therefore you don't have to look at your calendar and try to make sure that you fill all pages.
That's true. So great to see you.
Pleasure was mine.
Okay.
It's great to see
Say
you.
hi to Zoya for me.
I definitely
You're
will.
looking good. I hope you get some relief from your pain here.
My relief comes when I'm talking, focusing on something else.
You're busy.
And I'm forgetting.
No, that's an important point. That's why having things to do takes our mind off some of the things that are bothering us.
But I'm reading, and reading is difficult for me, therefore I'm trying to get the books, audiobooks. The last one that I got, it was No Chishpi, about Israel.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Good book?
It's simple. You might disagree with interpretation and facts, but it's full of Los Angeles vocabulary.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because she ended up living in Los Angeles, and
Yeah.
have a nice weekend.
You too.
I'll see
And
you.
say hi. It's so great
Hi.
to see you.
Say hi to Jackie.
I will, thank you.
I just need to get into the rabbinic suite, so I don't know, is that door locked?
It's not.
Oh.
It shouldn't be.
Okay, well, I assumed it was, but,
Yeah. I'm walking down that way.
Okay.
I'll be sure.
You know who somebody I was surprised didn't mention when talking about Moses being the greatest? We've been hearing all the last couple of days how Queen Elizabeth was the greatest monarch of England and there'll never be,
Interesting point.
and they're probably right.
Yeah. Yeah. And
For
I-
different reasons.